Welcome to the Sleep Time History channel. Here we create immersive first-person stories from the pages of history, told gently through the eyes of those who lived them. Each episode invites you to step into moments of the past. Walk quietly beside emperors, explorers, revolutionaries, and forgotten heroes, not as distant names, but as real people experiencing history firsthand. Our aim is simple: to help you relax, transport you somewhere peaceful, and guide you gently into sleep. If you've enjoyed this experience, please consider liking and subscribing. It genuinely helps our channel grow, enabling us to create more soothing content for you. And if you'd like to leave a comment, we'd love to hear which historical figures or moments you'd like us to cover next. Your ideas inspire future episodes. Thank you for joining us. Now, relax and let history carry you softly towards sleep. In tonight's episode, we journey to the cliffs and coastlines of Normandy, told through the eyes of a German machine gunner who stood watch on the eve of the D-Day landings. This is not a tale of victory or defeat. It's a quiet reflection on survival, memory, and the human cost of war. Close your eyes and let history carry you gently into sleep. The air was thick with stillness the day before it happened. I remember the sky, overcast but calm, and the sea beyond the cliffs lapping at the beach like it always did. No drama, no wind, no clue. I stood at my post with the others, squinting out into the grey morning from our concrete nest, the Atlantic Wall they called it, a line of defence that was supposed to be impenetrable. We'd built it stone by stone, brick by brick, like children trying to block the tide with sandcastles. I think some of us believed in it. I'm not sure I ever really did. I'd been stationed in Normandy for nearly a year. The routine had numbed me. Shifts, checks, oil the MG42, scan the beach, smoke, wait, write a letter I wouldn't send, sleep if the mice let me, then repeat. We were told the invasion would come eventually, but it had become a ghost story among us. We scared the new recruits with it, talked about ghost fleets and parachutes that drifted down like snow. The veterans rolled their eyes. Maybe next month, they'd mutter. Maybe never. But something felt different that day. Command had grown jumpy. More patrols, more questions. Our officer paced like a caged animal. He snapped at everything. The way we folded our bedrolls, how we handled the ammunition, even the volume of our whispers. "They're coming," he kept saying, not loudly, almost like a prayer. "They're coming." I remember a private, Fritz from Hamburg, asking if we were going to die. He said it plain, like he was asking the time. Nobody answered. What could we say? We all knew that if the Allies really came, this beach would be hell. We had the high ground, the bunkers, the barbed wire, but we also had orders to hold our ground until death. And I think we all knew, deep down, that death was more punctual than reinforcements. That night, I couldn't sleep. The barracks stank of sweat and nervousness. I sat by the slit window, watching the sea. The moon was hidden, but I could see the silver glint of the water. I thought I saw shadows moving far out on the horizon. Probably tricks of the eye, maybe not. Every sound felt louder. The creak of the floorboards, the ticking of my watch, the distant bark of some dog inland. I wanted to believe we had more time, but time had already run out. Before dawn they called us to stations. I grabbed my helmet, my rifle, and set the MG42 into its mount, my hands moving on their own. Muscle memory. The others moved like ghosts, silent, pale. Some crossed themselves, others just stared. Then we heard it. First the low drone, like thunder too far away to be real. Then it grew, louder and wider, until it was a scream from the sky itself. Bombers, thousands, they rained fire inland, not on us but behind us, cutting off the roads, the bridges, the rail. The earth shook beneath our boots. The sky turned orange. Trees in the distance became silhouettes in flame. I held on to the MG like it was an anchor in a storm. The ocean, once calm, now churned with steel. I saw it, God help me. I saw the fleet, ships beyond counting. Black shadows on the water. inching closer. So many they seemed to form a new continent. Beside me, Fritz vomited and wiped his mouth. I don't think he even noticed. Our officer screamed something, but the sound was swallowed by the sky. I thought of my mother. I thought of snow in the Black Forest. I thought of my dog, Hans, and the last time I laughed. I thought about what it meant to survive a war you didn't start and no longer believed in. And then the first shells landed on the beach, and the world came undone. The world exploded. That's the only way I can describe it. The first shells tore into the wire, the beach, the pillboxes. Our whole position trembled under the weight of it. Sand flew like bullets. Chunks of concrete, metal, and bone rained from above. Somewhere someone was screaming. Maybe it was me. Maybe it was Fritz. I don't know. I pressed myself behind the shield of the MG-42, heart battering my ribs, fingers clenched around the grips. The gun felt warm already, though I hadn't fired a shot. It was anticipation, nerves, pure survival. I kept my eyes on the shore. Shapes moved through the smoke. Landing craft, hundreds of them. Men spilling out like ants from a burning nest. The sea behind them boiled with more boats, more guns, more death. "Feuer!" the lieutenant shouted. His voice cracked. Then the guns sang. We opened up. The chatter of the MG-42, our Hitler's buzzsaw, ripped through the air. I aimed low, sweeping side to side as I'd been trained. It didn't feel like killing. It felt like trying to stop a tide with bullets. They kept coming. Some dropped before they reached the water. Others collapsed the moment they hit sand. But more followed, always more. Shells landed closer now. One struck the bunker next to us, vaporizing it. Just gone. A blinding light, then nothing. Dust and smoke swallowed everything. My ears rang. The machine gun jammed. My hands, slick with sweat, fumbled with the bolt. I cleared it, breathed once and resumed. Fritz was beside me, feeding the belt. His eyes were wide and unblinking, but he moved like a machine. I think he was gone already, just hadn't fallen yet. Time vanished. There were no minutes, no hours, just noise and fury. The sky itself seemed to burn. My throat was raw from shouting, or maybe from the smoke. I don't know. At some point the barrel of the MG overheated. We swapped it out, then again, and again. I saw things I wish I could forget. A man crawling without legs. Another, his uniform on fire, flinging himself into the surf. A landing craft hit dead on. Its occupants turned to mist. And always the sound. Shells, guns, screaming, the stutter of our MG, the rumble of tanks somewhere inland. War is not a movie. It is not glory. It is a meat grinder fed by men like me. The Americans kept coming. Some reached the base of the cliffs. I could see them now, up close, young, faces smeared with mud and blood, eyes wild. I shot until I couldn't tell if I was still hitting anything. Then the gun ran dry. Fritz was down. He'd been hit, a round through the neck. He looked surprised, like he'd forgotten this was a possibility. I dragged his body aside, but there was nowhere to put it. Blood soaked the sandbags. I shouted for ammo and someone threw me a box. The MG stuttered back to life. The lieutenant was down too, shrapnel, I think. Half his face was gone. I didn't look twice. Orders or no, it didn't matter. We were holding because we had no other choice. The air stank of salt, cordite, and death. Smoke rolled across the beach like fog. I could barely see. My ears rang with a high, constant pitch. Every so often, I'd stop firing just to breathe, to blink, to remember that I was still alive. My hands were blistered, my uniform soaked, my stomach empty. My soul, I don't know. We thought the sea was endless, but the Americans were relentless. They kept pushing, inch by bloody inch. Some made it past the wire. Some reached the cliffs. I saw one climb halfway before falling. Another made it to the base of our position. Then two more. They didn't look human anymore. Just shapes moving with purpose. Then the grenade came. It landed just outside the pillbox. The blast was blinding. I flew backward, crashing against the concrete. My ears went silent. The world turned white, then grey. Dust choked my lungs. I tasted blood. When I came to, I was on the floor. The MG was gone, twisted, ruined. The front wall was cracked. I could see the beach, closer than before, crawling with Americans. I reached for my sidearm. It was gone. I tried to stand. Pain bloomed in my leg. Shrapnel. Someone dragged me back. A voice shouted in German. A medic? A survivor? I couldn't tell. Then I blacked out again. I woke up sometime later in a trench, deeper inland. They'd pulled me back, not out of kindness. They needed every body they could still use. My leg was wrapped, my hands shaking. I asked about Fritz. No one answered. The sounds of battle still echoed, but the tide had shifted. We were losing ground. The beachhead was theirs. Our line, our wall, was broken. I stared at the dark sky, blinking through smoke and pain, and wondered how we'd believed we could stop it. How we thought this place would hold. How we thought we would walk away. I closed my eyes and listened to the silence beneath the chaos, the distant sound of boots, of orders shouted, of the sea, always the sea, behind it all. Tomorrow, I knew, would be worse. The next day came not with light, but with haze. Smoke clung to everything. Our boots, our breath, our minds. I sat slumped against a collapsed trench wall, the bandage on my leg damp and red. The medics had done what they could with what little they had. We had no proper field hospital, no anaesthetic, just rags and grit and men too exhausted to scream anymore. I wasn't sure what hour it was. Time had blurred into one long throb of noise and ache. The officers barked orders, but there were fewer of them now. Half the chain of command had been wiped out. We were scattered across the countryside, trying to regroup, to build a second line where the first had shattered. The Allies had broken through, that much we all knew. The beach was no longer a barrier, it was a platform. They were landing tanks now, trucks, artillery. It was no longer a question of if they'd come. It was how many and how fast. I had my rifle again. No MG-42, those were all either destroyed or reassigned. Now I was just another soldier in the mud, clutching a bolt-action weapon and hoping I wouldn't need to use it. We dug in as best we could, forming a hasty line in the hedgerows and tree lines inland. The fields around us were soaked with blood, and not all of it was theirs. Somewhere to the west I heard the roar of Sherman tanks. I remember that sound clearly, mechanical, confident, heavy, like the war itself had taken form and was now rolling steadily in our direction. A few of us still had Panzerfausts, not many. Most had been used or abandoned during the retreat. The Americans moved fast. We saw their scouts within hours. Young men, cautious but determined. One passed so close I could see the stubble on his cheek through my scope. I didn't fire. Not out of mercy. I simply couldn't make my finger obey. He was just a boy. So was I. That day we were ordered to hold a small farmhouse at the edge of a broken orchard. It wasn't fortified, just 4 stone walls and a splintered roof, but it offered a view of the road. I took up position in the attic, peering through a crack where a tile had fallen loose. I could see the road winding through the trees. If they came, this is where they'd pass. And come they did. Near dusk the first column appeared. Jeeps, half-tracks, and infantry moving cautiously but steadily. I reported it down to the sergeant. He told us to hold fire. We had maybe 15 men and barely enough ammunition for one good exchange. We waited. They passed, most of them. But then a straggling group approached the house. A patrol. Maybe they'd seen something. Maybe they were just being thorough. They stopped at the gate, rifles ready. The tension was unbearable. I felt sweat dripping down my back, soaking through my shirt. My finger twitched on the trigger. One wrong move, one creaking board, and it would all begin again. Someone downstairs coughed. The Americans turned. One shouted something. I couldn't hear it over the thudding in my ears. Then came the flash of a muzzle. The front wall of the house exploded into gunfire. Windows shattered. Plaster rained down. We fired back, but it was chaos. We were cornered, outnumbered and pinned. The return fire from the patrol was disciplined, accurate. One by one, I heard the cries of our men below. Short, sharp, final. In the attic I stayed low, firing once, twice, then reloading, heart hammering. I heard footsteps on the stairs. They were inside. I backed away, found a hatch in the roof, and climbed out onto the slates. The wind hit me like a slap. It smelled of cordite and distant sea spray. There was nowhere to go. The orchard below looked like a sea of shadows. I slithered down the far side of the roof, letting myself drop into the bushes behind the farmhouse. I crawled until my hands were raw and my uniform was torn. Then I ran. I don't know how long or how far. Through fields, over ditches, into woods. I avoided roads, followed the sounds of our retreating lines. Eventually, I found a small group, 5 soldiers, all as battered and hollow as I was. They didn't ask where I came from. I didn't ask their names. We were just fragments now, drifting from one shattered edge of the front to another. That night, we slept in a barn, or tried to. I lay on the hay, staring at the beams above me, listening to the muffled, distant gunfire. It never stopped, not anymore. Even in silence, I heard it. Someone lit a cigarette. Another shared a crust of bread. No one spoke of yesterday. No one spoke of tomorrow. Only the present remained, a moment stretched painfully between what we'd lost and what we still had to endure. I pulled my coat tighter, the pain in my leg, a dull throb now. I thought of Fritz again, of the MG-42, of the sea boiling with men. I wondered how many had died in my sights. I wondered how many I had saved by not firing. The barn creaked in the wind. Outside, the night was dark and cold. I closed my eyes, and for a moment, I imagined I was back home, in the Black Forest, before all of this, before the uniforms, before the orders, before the war turned me into something I didn't recognize. But the dream never lasted long. Not anymore. The morning after the firefight at the farmhouse, we moved again. Always moving, always falling back. Orders came through scattered channels, fragments of commands from voices we didn't know anymore. It was clear the front was disintegrating. Some men tried to hold, others simply vanished. Deserters, ghosts. We no longer had a map, just instinct and fear guiding our feet. I travelled with the same group of 5. We weren't a unit, just survivors clinging to each other for structure. There was an older man, Matthias, I think. He'd served in Africa, said almost nothing, carried himself like a man who already knew how this story ended. The others were younger, 2 barely shaving, one with a broken arm in a crude sling. I never learned their names. We didn't need them. We passed burned-out villages, the shells of churches, the twisted remains of what once was farmland. Every field seemed haunted. The air reeked of smoke, rot and diesel. We scavenged what we could. Water, stale bread, a rusted tin of beans. Our uniforms were caked in filth. My leg ached worse each day. But we didn't stop. Stopping meant being found. Sometimes we heard the Americans, distant engines, shouted orders in English, the crack of rifles. Other times it was our own. Disorganized pockets of Wehrmacht or SS, still clinging to the idea of a line to defend. We avoided them when we could. Authority had lost meaning. Discipline had thinned. All that remained was instinct. Stay alive, keep moving. Late one afternoon we came upon a field hospital. At least it had once been one. Now it was rubble and bodies, stretchers overturned, bandages fluttering in the wind, a wheelbarrow half buried in mud. Flies clouded everything. We didn't stay long, just long enough to take what morphine we could find. Pain didn't care who you were anymore. We kept to the hedgerows, the bocage, those cursed, thick, ancient walls of brush and earth. They made travel slow and dangerous. Every corner could hide an ambush, every path a trap. The Americans were adapting quickly, learning to use tanks and flamethrowers to flush us out. One evening we watched from a ridge as a platoon torched a German nest below. We saw the fire, heard the screams, we said nothing. Eventually, we reached a rail line, abandoned, tracks twisted from shell fire. A lone freight car stood off to the side, rusted and full of straw. We slept inside it that night, safe for a few hours. The sky outside was bruised with smoke and the stars were few. I lay in the straw, listening to Matthias snore softly and the others shift in their sleep. I thought again of the beach, of the MG42, of Fritz. I remembered his laugh, the way he used to sing under his breath. I remembered his eyes in those final seconds. Not fear, but confusion, like he'd stumbled into the wrong place and couldn't understand why. I felt something crack inside me then. Not pain, not grief, just a slow, hollow settling, like realizing you've been carrying something heavy and only just understood the weight of it. By dawn, we moved again. We found a convoy of Germans heading east, trucks, motorcycles, even some horses. They let us join. No questions. We were all headed the same way, away. We rode in silence, watching the countryside roll past like a dying animal. Columns of smoke rose on every horizon. Planes circled above, ours, theirs, who could say? Somewhere along the road I saw a boy, maybe 10. He stood alone by the ruins of a house, barefoot, holding a wooden toy. He didn't move, didn't wave, just stared as our convoy passed. His eyes met mine for only a second, but it was enough. There was no hatred there, just emptiness. A few kilometers later, the truck stopped. A bridge had been bombed out. We had to continue on foot. That's when the shelling began. It came fast. Artillery, likely American. The first explosion tossed 2 men into the air, like rag dolls. Then another hit a truck behind us. Screaming, fire, chaos. We scattered. I threw myself into a ditch, heart hammering. Dirt filled my mouth. I pressed my face into the mud and prayed, not to win, not to escape, just to stop, just to make it quiet. The barrage lasted maybe 5 minutes, felt like hours. When it ended, the world was still. No birds, no voices, just the smouldering remains of metal and men. I climbed out slowly. My ears rang. My leg throbbed. Around me, the survivors emerged one by one. Faces pale, movements slow, like animals after a flood. We regrouped. Fewer now. Matthias was gone. We didn't speak of it. That night, we found shelter in a half-collapsed barn. We ate what we had, shared the last of the morphine. Someone lit a candle. Its glow flickered on our tired faces. I lay awake long after the others slept. My thoughts drifted to the sea, to the cliffs, to the roar of aircraft and the rattle of gunfire. I thought of what it meant to be on the wrong side of history. I thought of home, not just the place, but the idea of it. Warmth, safety, laughter. It felt like a story I had once known, but could no longer recall. Sleep finally came, slow and cold, like fog creeping over a broken field. We moved eastward again the next morning, fewer than before. There were 4 of us now. I never asked where the 5th had gone. He'd been coughing the night before, rasping like something hollow. When we woke, his place was empty. No blood, no struggle, just the cold space where he'd lain. We didn't speak about it. The sun rose sluggishly behind the trees, its light filtered through haze and smoke. Normandy was scarred in every direction. Roads were cratered, villages silent, crops burned. We walked in single file down a narrow lane, hemmed by stone walls and thick hedges, weapons slung but ready. Each sound, a branch snapping, a bird taking flight, made us flinch. We didn't speak much anymore. There wasn't anything to say. No jokes, no stories, just the sound of boots on earth and the occasional clatter of a loose canteen. I held my rifle like a cane now, more for support than anything. My leg ached more each day, though I said nothing. Pain had become part of the rhythm. At midday we came upon a chapel, tucked between 2 hills. The bell tower had collapsed inward, and a large crater yawned in what had once been a garden. The stained glass was shattered, but the altar inside was untouched. Someone had lit candles there, recently. The wax was still warm. We weren't alone. We searched quickly, rifles raised. No signs of movement. Just the stillness of a place that had known too many tears. In the pews I found a French Bible, its pages stained and torn. I couldn't read it, but I held it for a moment anyway, feeling the weight of words I didn't know. Outside, we rested beneath the broken bell. One of the younger soldiers, Emile, I think, took out a photograph. A woman, holding a child. He stared at it for a long time before folding it back into his coat. He didn't speak, but I understood. I had no photographs, no letters, just memories, and even those were fading. We moved on. By evening, we reached a stretch of woodland. Thick trees, shelter. We built a small fire, carefully masked to avoid attention. The sky was turning red when the distant sound of artillery rolled in again. Not near, but steady. The front, wherever it was now, had not stopped moving. I found myself thinking more and more of home, not just my village, but the small routines I once had. The warmth of a morning coffee, the creak of the gate in the wind, the way the dog used to wait at the door. These thoughts came not as comforts, but as ghosts, reminders of a life I wasn't sure still existed. That night, Emile asked what I'd do after the war. It was the first time any of us had spoken at length in days. I didn't know how to answer. After? The word felt foreign, distant, like asking what comes after a storm, while still drenched to the bone. I don't know, I said eventually. Maybe nothing. He nodded as if that made perfect sense. Perhaps it did. He said he wanted to be a carpenter, build things, real things, tables, chairs, maybe houses, something solid, something useful. I envied him that clarity. I had no such plan. The war had taken that from me, taken the version of myself who once dreamed. We shared some of the last bread, stale and hard. The fire crackled quietly. Around us, the trees swayed, branches whispering to each other, like old men trading regrets. I lay back against a root and stared at the sky. There were stars tonight, not many, but enough to remind me the world was still turning. I slept fitfully. My dreams were filled with waves and wire, the rattle of gunfire, Fritz's eyes, the MG kicking against my shoulder. I woke before dawn, sweating, heart racing. It took me a moment to remember where I was, who I was. The others were still asleep. I stood and limped to the edge of the clearing. The forest opened slightly, revealing a slope down to a valley. Smoke curled there. Another village, maybe occupied, maybe not. I couldn't tell. I thought of laying down my weapon, just walking, heading for the village, finding a barn, pretending to be a farmer until the war passed over me. But I couldn't. Not because of loyalty. That was long gone. Just inertia. I didn't know how to stop moving. Behind me, someone stirred. The day was beginning again. Another day of walking. Another day of surviving. No destination. Just the quiet understanding that to stop was to disappear. The war was no longer about sides or flags or victory. It was about endurance. How long could we last? How much of ourselves could we hold on to? I didn't have an answer. Only the next step, the next breath, the next silent hour. And so we kept going. 4 shadows among the ruins, bound together by nothing more than the fact that we hadn't yet fallen. We passed through another village the following day, if you could still call it that. It had no name on any signpost, and most of the houses were hollowed-out shells. A church steeple had collapsed into the square. Doors hung from hinges. A dog barked somewhere, and then stopped, as if remembering silence was safer. There were bodies, civilians mostly. Some still wore aprons, work boots, Sunday coats. War didn't care what language you spoke, or whether you carried a weapon. It visited everyone. We didn't linger. We took some bread from a half-shattered pantry, filled our canteens from a cracked well, and moved on. The 4 of us, now more like ghosts in uniform than soldiers, headed east, guided by nothing but instinct and the desire not to be caught. The Americans were behind us, so were the British. The skies belonged to them. At every sound of engines above, we froze. Sometimes a plane passed by without noticing. Other times, they circled back. We learned to scatter fast, hide under hedges, in barns, in the shallow ditches that lined every old road. The fear never left. It clung to us like the mud on our boots. A few times we spotted Allied patrols in the distance, well-fed, well-equipped, laughing even. That sound struck me, Laughter. We hadn't heard it in so long. It almost sounded wrong, like it didn't belong in this world anymore. My leg was getting worse. I limped more heavily now. Emile offered to carry my rifle once, and I nearly bit his head off. Pride, I suppose, or shame. I didn't want to become a burden. Not when all we had left was each other. We reached a wooded area and decided to stay a while. Rest, regroup, maybe find a farm to trade with. It was a dangerous thought, but the hunger was becoming unbearable. That night we found a small shack, half collapsed, but dry. There were old tools, some rotted furniture, and a mattress crawling with mice. We shared it anyway. That evening, as the sun fell and the sky turned the colour of rust, I found myself staring at my reflection in a shard of broken mirror. I didn't recognise the face. Gaunt, dirt-streaked, eyes too wide. There was a deep crease between my brows that hadn't been there before. I touched it like it belonged to someone else. What had I become? I thought of the beach, the men I'd shot, the ones I'd failed to. I thought of the long months in silence, the drills, the propaganda. I thought of how easy it had been to believe in the machine when you were part of it, and how impossible it was now to see any meaning in it. Emile sat beside me, chewing what remained of the bread. "Do you think they'll shoot us if we surrender?" he asked. I didn't know. We'd heard stories, some real, some invented to keep us fighting. I told him the truth. "I don't think they want more blood." He nodded. "I hope not. I'm tired of this." I was too, bone-deep tired, tired in the soul, if such a thing still existed. The next morning we were spotted. We'd gone to a nearby orchard looking for fruit, anything. A child's shout gave us away. We froze. A few seconds later, the command came from the trees, English, loud and firm. "Drop your weapons." We didn't run. We didn't even hesitate. We dropped our rifles in the dirt and raised our hands. It felt strange, light, like I'd put down more than a weapon. They emerged from the trees, 4 of them, guns raised but not shaking, young like us. One of them had freckles, another wore a bandana instead of a helmet. They looked at us with tired eyes, then gestured for us to step forward. "Move," one said. "Slow." We did. No words, no resistance, just an understanding. We were done. They marched us to a small clearing where a larger group waited. There were tanks, jeeps, crates of supplies. One soldier offered us water, another searched us gently. I saw no hate in their eyes, just caution, perhaps pity. We were taken to a makeshift holding area, a cordoned field with barbed wire and a few tents. Other prisoners were already there, some wounded, some asleep on the grass. I saw a familiar face but couldn't place his name. We nodded to each other, nothing more. That night, I lay under a sky so clear it felt unreal. Stars above me, the sound of distant trucks and the low hum of generators. I was no longer a soldier, no longer a threat, just a man, a prisoner, a survivor. I should have felt fear or shame or relief, but I felt nothing, just an immense stillness, like the war had finally stepped away from me, and all that remained was the echo. I closed my eyes and thought of the waves at Omaha, the scent of seaweed, the first time I fired the MG-42, the last time I saw Fritz. And then, for the first time in months, I slept deeply. No gunfire in my ears, no aching in my heart, just sleep. As if the war had finally taken its hands from my throat. Captivity was not what I expected. There were no cells, no shouting guards, no harsh lights. Just open sky, barbed wire, and rows of tired faces. We were moved from the field to a larger camp inland, transported in trucks that smelled of oil and dust. Soldiers watched us, but they weren't cruel. Most didn't speak. A few offered us cigarettes. I took one and smoked it slowly. The taste unfamiliar, but oddly comforting. The camp had tents, latrines, and a line where food was handed out. Twice a day, if supplies allowed. It wasn't much. Bread, broth, sometimes beans. But it was more than I'd had in weeks. The men around me were from every branch of the German army. Infantry, panzer crews, engineers. Some still wore medals, some had no shoes. We didn't talk about the war, not directly. What was there to say? I spent my days quietly, sitting in the dirt, watching the wind play with the grass, listening to the murmur of voices, sometimes a harmonica, sometimes laughter. That surprised me. Men laughing, not in joy but in disbelief, in relief, in exhaustion. I wrote letters in my head, to my mother, to no one. I imagined telling her everything, about the beach, about Fritz, about the long walk east. I pictured her reading it, then folding it carefully and placing it in a drawer, not knowing what to do with it. One afternoon, a British officer visited the camp. He walked among us with a translator, asking quiet questions. Where had we fought? What units had we served in? I told the truth. MG 42 gunner, Normandy coast. I saw him pause. His eyes didn't change, but his stance did, a little stiffer. He nodded and moved on. Later that evening I sat with Emil by the fence. He was drawing in the dirt with a stick, sketching what looked like a house. "Is that yours?" I asked. "Will be," he said, "when I go home." It hit me then. He believed he would. He saw a future, a door to step through. I tried to picture one for myself, but it felt hazy, like something seen underwater. Days passed, then weeks. The war moved on without us. We heard rumours, Paris liberated, the Allies pushing into Germany. Sometimes a guard would share news, sometimes another prisoner. We pieced the story together, like men assembling a shattered photograph. And then came the day they told us we would be moved again. A train this time, east, then north, to a permanent camp, more structure, more rules. I felt nothing. Just a dull sense of inevitability, like a stone rolling downhill. The train was crowded but quiet. We sat on wooden benches or on the floor. Outside the windows, France passed in slow motion. Fields, forests, rivers, towns with half their buildings missing, children waving, sometimes scowling. I didn't wave back. At the new camp we were processed, names recorded, numbers assigned. I became one more file in a drawer somewhere, but I didn't mind. I'd already lost the version of myself that had once needed a name. Life became routine: wake, eat, wait, sleep. There were work details: chopping wood, digging, hauling supplies. I volunteered when I could. It passed the time, made me feel useful. My leg had healed enough to bear weight again, though it ached in the rain. One night, Emil didn't return from the infirmary. The guards said he'd been moved to a hospital, but I never saw him again. His absence was a quiet wound, like a chair missing at a familiar table. I kept to myself after that. Days blurred. I stopped counting. Instead, I watched the sky change. I listened to the seasons. I let the silence settle into me, like dust on an old shelf. Then one day, months later, we were told the war was over. Just like that. The announcement came over a loudspeaker, monotone, final, no cheering, no ceremony, just the end. Some men cried, some laughed. I sat down and stared at the ground. I didn't know what to feel. The war had ended, but it still lived inside me, in the scars, the memories, the eyes I saw when I tried to sleep. There were papers, forms, interviews. We were no longer prisoners of war. We were displaced persons, stateless men in borrowed clothes. I was told I could go home if I wanted. So I went. The journey back was long. Trains, trucks, walking. My village had changed. Fewer people, fewer buildings. The gate still creaked, but the dog was gone. My mother opened the door, and for a long moment we just stared at each other. Then she embraced me, and I cried, for the first time. I never told her everything. Some stories are not meant to be spoken. But I tried to live differently. I found work. I built furniture with my hands. I planted a garden. I watched the seasons pass, and at night, when the memories came, I let them. I didn't fight them. I let them pass through me like a storm, and then fade, because I had lived. And that, in the end, was all I could do. Live reflections. in the days that followed. June 6, 1944, the beaches of Normandy slowly transformed from chaotic battlegrounds into footholds of a vast military campaign. The initial waves of Operation Overlord had struck the Atlantic Wall with relentless force, but the landings were just the beginning of a long, grinding struggle. As Allied troops pushed inland, they encountered not just hedgerows and farmlands, but a deeply entrenched and well-coordinated German defence. The German Wehrmacht, though stunned by the scale of the invasion, quickly regrouped. Field Marshal Erwin Rommel had predicted an invasion, but even he was surprised by its sheer magnitude. The German High Command struggled to respond with clarity. Hitler, famously indecisive in those critical hours, held back key armoured divisions, fearing a second landing elsewhere. The delay proved costly. Still, German forces in the region mounted a fierce resistance. The bocage countryside of Normandy, thick with hedgerows and narrow roads, favoured the defenders. German machine gunners, mortarmen and snipers utilised the terrain expertly, inflicting heavy casualties and slowing the Allied advance to a crawl. Every village became a strong point, every field a potential ambush. In towns like Carentan and Caen, fighting was especially brutal. The German 12th SS Panzer Division, composed largely of Hitler Youth, fought with fanatical determination. The Allies responded with overwhelming firepower, including naval bombardments and relentless aerial bombing, reducing entire neighbourhoods to rubble. Civilians suffered terribly in the crossfire, and the pastoral beauty of northern France was scarred deeply by fire and steel. As the days turned into weeks, the logistical prowess of the Allies began to show. Artificial harbours, mulberries, allowed a constant flow of men, machines, and supplies to reinforce the beachhead. The Germans, by contrast, struggled with stretched supply lines and constant air attacks on their transportation networks. Bridges were destroyed, railways disrupted, convoys harried from the sky. The once dominant Luftwaffe was now a shadow of its former self, unable to challenge Allied air superiority. German morale, already shaken, began to erode further under the weight of continuous bombardment and the realization that reinforcements were not coming in sufficient strength. By early July, the Allies had expanded their control, but progress remained painfully slow. The Americans moved through the western sector toward Cherbourg, a key port, capturing it after bitter combat. The British and Canadians, meanwhile, pressed toward Caen, encountering some of the stiffest resistance of the entire campaign. Caen, which had been an objective for D-Day itself, did not fall until weeks later, after a series of devastating assaults and counter-assaults. The German defenders, though outgunned, fought with skill and tenacity, using Panther and Tiger tanks to great effect in ambushes and counterattacks. Yet the tide was turning. Allied forces now outnumbered the Germans significantly in both manpower and material. The air belonged to the Allies, and with each passing day, their grip on Normandy tightened. Resistance movements in occupied France began to step up sabotage efforts, cutting telephone lines, ambushing convoys, and feeding intelligence to the advancing armies. German units, already stretched thin, now had to contend with threats from within as well as without. Despite the grim determination of many German soldiers, it became clear that the defensive line could not hold indefinitely. The Allied breakthrough would come not with a single blow, but with sustained pressure, logistical dominance, and the relentless accumulation of small victories. For the Germans, the aftermath of D-Day was the slow unravelling of their western front, the beginning of a retreat that would not end until the gates of Berlin. And for those caught in the middle, soldiers, civilians, and prisoners of war, it marked the beginning of a long and brutal campaign whose echoes would linger for generations. By mid-July 1944, the landscape of Normandy bore little resemblance to the peaceful countryside it had once been. Craters pocked the fields, villages were smouldering ruins, and the air hummed with the constant drone of aircraft and the distant rumble of artillery. For the German defenders, the psychological and physical toll of the prolonged engagement was beginning to show. Days blurred together in a haze of smoke and exhaustion. With every passing moment, the Allied noose tightened further. What began as a beachhead was evolving into a staging ground for a vast and growing Allied army. Supplies continued to pour ashore, and the tempo of operations increased. The Americans had broken out towards St. Lo, while British and Canadian forces made repeated attempts to capture Caen and push eastward. Resistance remained fierce, with German units fiercely contesting every crossroads and village. But the cracks in their defence were becoming more apparent. German command and control struggled under the weight of relentless pressure and disrupted communications. Field reports became more sporadic, and coordinating counterattacks proved increasingly difficult. Many of the experienced officers had already been killed or wounded, and replacements were often hastily conscripted soldiers or foreign volunteers with limited training. Morale was wavering. Letters from home painted a bleak picture. Allied bombings, food shortages, and the growing sense that the war was turning irrevocably against Germany. Inside the bunkers and trenches, fear mingled with resignation. For many German soldiers, the thought of surrender was terrifying, especially given the uncertainty of how they would be treated. And yet, the belief in ultimate victory was fading. By the end of July, the Allies launched Operation Cobra, a concentrated American offensive that shattered the German front near St. Lo. With the help of massive aerial bombardments, entire German units were obliterated or forced into disorganized retreats. The countryside that had offered such strong defensive advantages now became a death trap. Columns of German vehicles attempting to withdraw were targeted from the air by Allied fighter bombers who prowled the skies with impunity. The infamous Falaise Pocket began to form in early August. As German forces attempted to regroup and hold the line near Argenton and Falaise, Allied forces encircled them. The trap began to close. In a frantic attempt to escape, German troops tried to break through narrow corridors, but the routes were under constant attack. The result was catastrophic. Tens of thousands of German soldiers were killed or captured. Wrecked vehicles, bodies, and abandoned equipment littered the roads. Survivors described it as a vision of hell. Deafening explosions, smoke-choked air, and the unrelenting advance of enemy troops. The Falaise Pocket became symbolic of the collapse of German resistance in Normandy. With its fall, what remained of the German forces in the region retreated eastward in disarray. The Allies advanced swiftly across northern France, liberating town after town. Paris would be free by the end of August, and the German dream of holding France was definitively over. The aftermath for the German army was one of retreat and reassessment. The loss of men, material, and strategic position in Normandy marked a turning point on the Western Front. What had begun as a desperate effort to repel the landings had become a catastrophic defeat. And for the ordinary soldiers who survived the campaign, the shadow of what was to come, defending the Reich from within its own borders, loomed darkly ahead. By early September 1944, the momentum of the Allied advance across France seemed almost unstoppable. Following the liberation of Paris, the German army was in full retreat, scrambling to re-establish defensive positions across the borders of Belgium and the Netherlands. For those who had survived the brutal fighting in Normandy, the pace of events was disorienting. Entire German divisions had been shattered, leaving the remnants to regroup hastily behind hastily prepared fortifications. The Allies, fueled by their recent success, pushed forward with confidence. Cities like Brussels and Antwerp were liberated with surprising speed. However, the rapid advance brought its own set of challenges. Supply lines were stretched to breaking point. Fuel, ammunition, and food were needed in vast quantities, and the further the Allies moved from Normandy, the more difficult logistics became. The famous Red Ball Express, an enormous convoy system, was created to address these issues, but it was an imperfect solution. Meanwhile, the Germans were not idle. As they retreated, they regrouped along the Siegfried Line, a formidable defensive network protecting the western borders of the German heartland. Reinforcements were rushed in, and surviving units were re-equipped. Despite the losses in Normandy, the Wehrmacht remained a capable and dangerous force. Hitler, now fully aware of the existential threat posed by the Western Allies, ordered a stiffened resistance. He also placed renewed faith in upcoming secret weapons, like the V-1 flying bomb and the V-2 rocket, as means to shift the balance. Morale among German troops remained low, but a sense of grim determination began to replace the chaos of the previous months. The failure of swift Allied advances to fully encircle retreating forces meant many experienced German troops lived to fight another day. In September, the Allies launched Operation Market Garden, a bold plan to leapfrog across the Netherlands using airborne forces to seize key bridges, allowing ground troops to push into the Ruhr, Germany's industrial heartland. It was daring, ambitious, and ultimately flawed. While initial objectives were met, the operation faltered at Arnhem, where the British 1st Airborne Division faced unexpectedly strong German resistance and was cut off. The defeat at Arnhem marked a pause in the Allies' rapid advance. For the Germans, it was a rare and significant defensive success, and it bought valuable time to reinforce their lines. As autumn deepened, the war entered a new phase. The front lines stabilized, and both sides began to prepare for the bitter winter ahead. German commanders, though under enormous strain, took stock of the situation. They knew that once the Allies reorganized and resupplied, another major offensive was inevitable. In the cities and villages of Western Germany, civilians began to experience the hardships of war more directly. Bombing raids increased in frequency and intensity, and the sound of artillery was no longer a distant echo but a nearby reality. Refugees flowed eastward, seeking shelter from the advancing Allies. The German propaganda machine urged citizens to stand firm, painting the conflict as a battle for survival. On the front lines, soldiers dug in. Defensive networks were expanded, and panzer units were held in reserve for counterattacks. While resources were limited and the Luftwaffe struggled to maintain relevance, German planners hoped that terrain, weather, and the overextension of Allied forces would provide an opportunity to strike back. As the Western Front settled into a temporary stalemate, the Eastern Front was boiling with activity. The Red Army was advancing steadily through Eastern Europe, pressing toward Germany from the opposite direction. The reality of a two-front war was bearing down with full force. Germany's strategic position had become untenable, and yet, in the face of this crushing reality, the Third Reich refused to yield. For the German High Command, the period after the collapse in Normandy was about buying time to regroup, time to prepare, and time to hope for some political or military miracle. But for many ordinary soldiers, each day brought new losses, new fatigue, and the creeping realization that the end, though still months away, was no longer a question of if, but when. As the final months of 1944 approached, the Western Front was entering a period of eerie quiet, punctuated by bursts of violence. The Allies had liberated much of France, Belgium, and Luxembourg, but progress slowed as logistical strains, difficult terrain, and worsening weather conditions took their toll. Meanwhile, German forces, though battered and depleted, were far from defeated. The German High Command, under Hitler's increasingly erratic direction, was planning a counteroffensive that they believed could change the course of the war. This effort would soon culminate in the Battle of the Bulge. In the Ardennes, a region the Allies had considered relatively quiet and poorly suited for a major offensive, German units amassed in secrecy. Fuel and manpower were scrounged from already scarce reserves. The goal was audacious: to split the British and American lines, recapture Antwerp, and force the Western Allies into a negotiated peace. For many of the soldiers preparing for this surprise attack, it was a final gamble. They knew the risks, understood the limits of their resources, but held fast to the hope that one decisive blow might yet alter the tide. On December 16th, 1944, the German offensive began. Caught off guard, Allied forces were initially thrown into disarray. The dense forests and narrow roads of the Ardennes worked in Germany's favour, masking their movements and blunting the impact of Allied air superiority, which was grounded due to poor weather. Panzer divisions surged forward, and towns such as Bastogne became focal points of fierce resistance. American units, although outnumbered and encircled, held their ground with incredible tenacity. The famous stand at Bastogne by the 101st Airborne Division became a symbol of Allied resilience. German troops, initially buoyed by their advance, soon encountered fierce resistance, worsening supply shortages, and improving weather that allowed Allied aircraft to return to the skies. The counteroffensive faltered. By mid-January 1945, the Allies had not only halted the German advance, but had pushed them back to their starting positions. The Battle of the Bulge was a tactical failure for Germany and a strategic disaster. They had expended critical reserves of men, tanks, and fuel for little lasting gain. For the German army, the defeat confirmed what many had begun to suspect. The war in the West could no longer be won. Morale plummeted, the winter was harsh, and the conditions on the front were grim. Supplies were meagre, and reinforcements were often teenage conscripts or elderly men pulled from the Volkssturm, Germany's national militia. Yet still the war ground on. In the aftermath of the failed offensive, the Allies resumed their advance. Cities in western Germany came under increasing assault. Cologne, Aachen, and others endured heavy bombardment and street fighting. German defensive lines crumbled steadily under the combined weight of American, British, and Canadian forces. The Rhine River, long a natural barrier and psychological symbol of German security, was now in the sights of the Allies. Crossing it would mark the final phase of the Western campaign. Inside Germany, the mood darkened further. Bombing raids devastated urban centres. Civilians lived in fear and uncertainty, huddled in cellars and listening to the distant approach of artillery. The regime's propaganda urged unyielding resistance, but many had lost faith. Quiet acts of defiance and despair increased. Deserters were hunted ruthlessly, and summary executions became more common. In this grim landscape, the German military machine continued to function, but only just. Commanders made plans for holding actions, scorched earth retreats, and delaying tactics. Some believed in a final stand, others simply sought to prolong the inevitable. The war was no longer about victory, but about survival, day by day, battle by battle. As January turned into February, the Allied push toward the Rhine intensified, setting the stage for the final assaults that would carry them into the heart of the Third Reich. By March 1945, the Allies were poised to cross the Rhine River and strike deep into the heart of Germany. The once distant fear of invasion had become a daily reality for German soldiers and civilians alike. Towns and cities west of the Rhine were falling rapidly, and resistance, while still determined in places, was increasingly fragmented. The German army was no longer the cohesive force it had once been. Unit cohesion was breaking down, and many divisions existed in name only, cobbled together from remnants of shattered formations. Yet despite this collapse, there were still pockets of organised and fierce resistance. Hitler had declared that every village, every street must be defended to the last man. The concept of total war had taken hold, with orders to destroy bridges, factories, and infrastructure to deny them to the advancing Allies. In some areas, fanatical SS units enforced these orders ruthlessly, executing those who showed signs of defeatism or retreat. Still, the overall picture was one of a nation unravelling. On March 7th, American forces captured the Ludendorff Bridge at Remagen, an unexpected and critical breakthrough. The bridge was one of the few crossings over the Rhine still standing, and its capture allowed the Allies to establish a bridgehead on the eastern bank. From there, the collapse of German defensive lines accelerated. Within weeks, multiple Allied armies had crossed the river at various points, pushing rapidly into central Germany. Cities like Frankfurt, Mainz, and Wiesbaden fell in quick succession. For German commanders, the challenge was no longer about organising defences, but delaying the inevitable and managing the chaos. Communications were unreliable, supply chains were non-existent, armoured units lacked fuel, and infantry divisions often had no proper weapons or uniforms. The Luftwaffe, once the pride of the Reich, was virtually grounded. Allied air power dominated the skies, striking not just military targets but railways, columns of retreating troops, and bridges. For those on the ground, both soldiers and civilians, there was no safe place. Meanwhile, the Allies were increasingly encountering the human cost of the Nazi regime. As they advanced, they began to uncover concentration camps and forced labour facilities. What they found shocked even the most hardened veterans. Emaciated prisoners, mass graves, and evidence of systematic murder revealed the full extent of the Holocaust. These discoveries reinforced the Allies' resolve and painted the conflict in even starker moral terms. For German troops who surrendered, the reception varied. While most were treated according to the Geneva Conventions, SS members and those associated with atrocities often faced summary justice. The war had entered a brutal final phase. Hitler, isolated in his Berlin bunker, refused to accept the military reality. He issued orders to imaginary divisions and dismissed commanders who spoke truthfully. The regime's inner circle had narrowed, and paranoia reigned. In the east, the Soviet Red Army was making its own devastating advance. Cities like Königsberg and Breslau were falling under intense bombardment, and civilians fled westward in panic. Millions of refugees clogged the roads, hoping to surrender to Western forces rather than fall into Soviet hands. The situation grew more desperate by the day. In Western Germany, cities were reduced to rubble. Aachen had already fallen after fierce fighting, and now the Ruhr, Germany's industrial heartland, came under direct assault. Encircled in what became known as the Ruhr Pocket, over 300,000 German soldiers were captured. The loss of the Ruhr was a devastating blow, not just militarily, but psychologically. The last major reserve of manpower and production capability had been lost. Resistance still continued in some quarters, but increasingly it was disorganized and futile. Entire towns surrendered without a shot, their leaders preferring capture to senseless destruction. But others resisted, sometimes under the coercion of Nazi officials who still clung to the fantasy of a turnaround. The Allies now pushed toward the Elbe River, the agreed meeting point with Soviet forces. As they did, they liberated more camps and encountered further evidence of Nazi crimes. The war was rapidly approaching its conclusion, but the devastation continued. German cities were bombed until the last weeks. Dresden, flattened in February, became emblematic of the destruction. Civilians were dying in vast numbers, not just from bombing, but from hunger, exposure, and the collapse of medical infrastructure. The German state was dissolving before their eyes. For the soldiers who had once fought on distant fronts in North Africa, France, and Russia, this was the final reckoning. The dream of conquest had turned to ruin. For many, there was no longer a cause to believe in, only a hope for survival. The story of Germany's Western war in these final months was not one of strategic manoeuvre, but of collapse, despair, and reckoning with a legacy that could no longer be denied. By April 1945, Germany was in its death throes. The Allied advance from the west and the Soviet surge from the east were now deep inside the borders of the Reich. Cities had become battlegrounds, forests turned into ambush sites, and roads were clogged with desperate civilians fleeing the violence and destruction behind them. German command structures had crumbled under the pressure of defeat, and orders were often delayed, conflicting, or ignored altogether. Despite the utter collapse of strategic cohesion, many German units continued to fight, driven by fear, loyalty, or the sheer instinct to survive. The Western Allies, pushing rapidly across central Germany, captured city after city. Leipzig, Nuremberg, and Munich fell in quick succession. Resistance was sporadic, sometimes fanatical, sometimes token, but the outcome was no longer in doubt. The Wehrmacht was broken. American, British, and Canadian troops liberated more concentration camps as they moved eastward, uncovering further horrors. In places like Buchenwald and Dachau, Allied forces found thousands of starving, dying prisoners and evidence of atrocities that would haunt the world for decades. These discoveries made it clear that the war had not been merely a military conflict, but a moral reckoning. On the Eastern Front, the Red Army had launched its final offensive, slicing through the remnants of German defences with overwhelming force. They advanced through Silesia, crossed the Oder River, and surrounded Berlin. German soldiers, often teenagers and old men, tried to hold the line with outdated weapons and dwindling ammunition. The Soviet assault was relentless. Artillery pounded the city day and night, while tanks rolled through suburbs reduced to rubble. Street fighting was brutal and personal, with buildings changing hands multiple times in a single day. Inside Berlin, Hitler refused to leave the Führer bunker beneath the Reich Chancellery. Surrounded by a shrinking circle of loyalists, he issued impossible orders to non-existent armies and accused his generals of betrayal. The city around him was collapsing. Bridges were blown, power was lost, and food became scarce. Civilians endured constant shelling, and many took their own lives to avoid capture, or worse. On April 25th, American and Soviet forces met at the Elbe River near Torgau. The link-up marked a symbolic moment. The pincers of Allied might had closed around Nazi Germany. Communication between East and West was limited, but the mutual recognition of their shared goal, ending the war, was clear. In Berlin, the end was near. Hitler's suicide on April 30th signalled the disintegration of what little remained of the Nazi command structure. His designated successor, Admiral Karl Dönitz, took control and attempted to negotiate a partial surrender to the Western Allies, hoping to delay Soviet occupation. But the Allies demanded unconditional surrender on all fronts. On May 2nd, Berlin surrendered to Soviet forces. A few days later, on May 7th, Germany signed an unconditional surrender at Reims, followed by a second formal act in Berlin on May 8th. The war in Europe was officially over. For Germany, the aftermath was a landscape of ruin. Cities were flattened, millions were dead, and countless more were displaced. The infrastructure of daily life, food, water, shelter, had been obliterated. Survivors emerged from basements and forests into a world unrecognizable from what had existed just a few years before. The Allied occupation began almost immediately. Germany was divided into 4 zones: American, British, French, and Soviet. Each power assumed responsibility for rebuilding, demilitarizing, and denazifying its zone. War crimes trials were planned, and leaders of the Nazi regime were arrested. But justice, however necessary, was slow and complex. The process of reckoning with the past had only just begun. For ordinary Germans, daily life became a matter of survival. Hunger was rampant, and the black market thrived. Families searched for missing relatives, while others tried to hide their association with the regime. Some welcomed the end of the war with relief, others with shame, and still others with resentment. The emotional scars were as deep as the physical ones. The country had been reduced not just in power and territory, but in spirit. The myth of invincibility had been shattered. Germany's ambitions had ended not in glory, but in destruction. The legacy of the war would stretch on for generations. Millions of soldiers never returned. Entire communities were gone. and the images of the camps, of skeletal survivors and mass graves became etched into the global conscience. This was not just the end of a war, but the end of an era. The reckoning had come, and it would take decades to understand fully. The price that had been paid. In the weeks following Germany's surrender in May 1945, a profound silence settled across the continent. The guns fell quiet, the skies cleared of bombers, and the long agonizing march of war gave way to the first fragile moments of peace. But this was not a triumphant peace. For Germany, the cost of its ambitions was laid bare in every direction. Cities lay in ruins, millions were dead. The once proud Reich had been reduced to a smouldering wasteland, divided by foreign powers, its people displaced, traumatized, and unsure of what came next. The occupying forces moved quickly to assert control. In the West, American, British, and French troops established provisional governments, distributed food and medical aid, and began the slow process of rebuilding. In the East, the Soviets established a firmer grip, bringing with them a different vision for Germany's future. A deep divide began to form, not just geographically, but ideologically. In Berlin, the city was divided into sectors, a harbinger of the Cold War tensions to come. But in those early days, the focus remained on survival and reckoning. One of the Allies' primary goals was the denazification of German society. The Nuremberg trials, beginning in late 1945, brought leading figures of the Nazi regime to justice. The world watched as evidence was presented, photos, documents, testimonies that confirmed the vast scale of war crimes and genocide. Many Germans, even those who had lived under the regime for years, were forced to confront truths they had denied or ignored. Across the country, people wrestled with guilt, shame, and loss. In the rubble of once great cities like Dresden, Cologne, and Hamburg, families picked through debris for anything salvageable. Schools reopened in shattered buildings, and churches held services amid crumbled walls. Children born during the war knew only hardship, while returning soldiers struggled to find their place in a country that had ceased to exist in the form they once knew. For many, the emotional scars ran deeper than the physical ones. The trauma of bombings, the loss of loved ones, the moral reckoning with what had been done in their name, these were wounds that would not heal quickly. Some Germans clung to old ideologies, resentful of the occupation and humiliated by defeat. Others turned inward, focusing on family and survival. The immediate post-war years were marked by hunger, homelessness, and fear of the future. The black market thrived, as did crime. Entire communities had been uprooted, particularly in the East, where millions of ethnic Germans were expelled from territories now ceded to Poland and the Soviet Union. Trains full of refugees arrived in Western Germany daily, adding strain to already overburdened towns and cities. Despite the devastation, seeds of renewal began to sprout. Aid from the United Nations, Relief and Rehabilitation Administration, and later the Marshall Plan, began to ease suffering. New political parties emerged, cautiously at first, and discussions about a future German state began to take shape. Still, there was no consensus on what that future should look like. The shadow of the past loomed large. In some ways, the cultural identity of Germany fractured. The older generation, steeped in memories of the Kaiserreich and then the Third Reich, often found themselves disconnected from the youth who came of age in the aftermath. A new generation, unburdened by direct complicity, began asking hard questions about responsibility and memory. This generational divide would shape Germany's post-war soul for decades. Meanwhile, the physical landscape slowly changed. Rubble was cleared by hand in many cases, brick by brick. Temporary housing sprouted on the outskirts of destroyed cities. Rail lines were repaired and factories slowly returned to operation, not for war production, but for rebuilding. Life resumed, haltingly. In churches, prayers were offered not just for the dead, but for forgiveness. In schools, children were taught new histories, ones that did not glorify conquest, but emphasized democracy and peace. Yet the legacy of the war lingered in every family story, every empty chair at the dinner table. In the former concentration camps, memorials were erected. Some were preserved in their ruined state as a warning, others rebuilt into museums of memory. Visitors came from around the world to bear witness, to understand, to mourn. For Germany, these places became sacred and solemn, reminders of how far a nation could fall. The division of Germany into East and West hardened in the late 1940s, setting the stage for the Cold War. The Federal Republic of Germany and the German Democratic Republic emerged. Two nations with the same language and history, but vastly different paths. In the West, the democratic state rebuilt itself with Western aid and influence. In the East, a socialist regime rose under Soviet control. For decades, the physical and ideological division of the country mirrored its fractured soul. But the post-war years also saw moments of incredible resilience and humanity. Former enemies reconciled. Survivors told their stories. Artists, writers, and thinkers sought meaning in the ruins. Slowly, painfully, Germany began to rebuild. Not just its cities, but its place in the world. By confronting the darkest chapters of its history, it laid the groundwork for a new kind of identity, one rooted in humility, remembrance, and a commitment to peace. The war that began with dreams of domination ended with silence, reflection, and the long, hard journey toward redemption. And though the scars remain, they have become part of a collective memory that ensures the past is neither forgotten nor repeated.